Okay, well, the research suggests that thousands and thousands of people all over the world believe that this is the time, our new era requires the new type of investments. And the whole idea of using profit-seeking investment to generate social and environmental good is moving away from sort of periphery to the mainstream. And the numbers that we have, it's hard to calculate, but the research suggests that over $500 billion will be generated in the next decade with this sort of investment. And we're just moving into this new type of investing, and there are a few people who are working in impact investing, this idea. So we have Ira Ehrenpreis. It's an honor to have him here at our event. And he is this type of a unique activist and investor in social good. Ira, welcome on stage. I wanted you to be here while I'm talking about you. I didn't want you to stand over there. So Ira is a founder and managing partner at DBL Partners and a recognized leader in the venture capital industry. He served on board and executive committee and as an annual meeting chairman of the National Venture Capital Association. He currently serves as the president of the Western Association of Venture Capitalists and is the chairman of the VC Network, which is the largest and most active California venture capital organization. The list of his awards, I mean, it's just endless. I'll name one, okay? So that's he was named the top 50 most influential men under 45.
When I was under 45.
Yeah, your wife might be so proud of you, Helen. Okay, so Ira invested at the very early stage in a wide range of companies. Two of them are very, very famous, which is Tesla and SpaceX. I don't think there is any single person in the room who doesn't know these companies. So very, very happy to have you here. Now, you are a unique investor, right? And DBL Partners is a unique firm. So let's talk a little bit about it and your unique philosophy and approach to investment.
Thanks, Anna. Well, let me just start by saying a huge congratulations to you and Stas and the entire SVOD team. You know, every year when I come to this, I'm more and more impressed, and you make it look easy, and I know how much hard work comes into this. So just one big round of applause again for you. I also want to give a special thanks because the person sitting here in the front is actually the gentleman who inspired me to become a venture capitalist 25 years ago. And I am in a very large club of people that Pitch Johnson actually was the inspiration for. There's like this club of VCs out there who all tribute Pitch from the early years as being their inspiration. So one extra big thank you to Pitch for long ago inspiring me. So DBL stands for double bottom line. And the core thesis of DBL is that there isn't a trade-off between aspiring for top-tier financial returns and trying to create some form of social or environmental return as well. And it's really trying to debunk the myth that these concepts are mutually exclusive, but in fact, and particularly for the venture asset class, they're mutually reinforcing. And it's this idea that you can create an economic engine, a capitalist engine, for tackling some of the most important problems we face in the 21st century. And it's a function of it being a unique time as a result of the kind of entrepreneurs that are really focused on this space today.
So talk a little bit about the philosophy and your approach.
So, you know, we've come a long way from this idea that doing well and doing good, you know, couldn't be done together. And when we actually invest in companies, what we're doing is we're investing in sectors that actually create some form of social and environmental good. But more importantly, we're backing entrepreneurs that are purpose-driven. And it really is about, in any VC who talks about how great they are or how brilliant their thesis is completely missing the point. All we are is trying to find and attract and partner with the very best entrepreneurs on the planet. And there's been this incredible evolution. I think of it in some ways as we've gone from a Rockefeller era when the idea was make a bunch of money during one's life and focus just on that. And then when you die, you can figure out how your foundation gives money away to things you care about. We then migrated, I think of it as a bit of what Bill Gates did, which is make money during the first 2/3 of your life, and then maybe the back third, think about what you care about. And now what we have are a set of entrepreneurs who do not want that forced trade-off. They actually want integration. They are unapologetically capitalistic. There's no doubt that what we're trying to do is build great companies and have financial outcomes. But it is around things where people are mission-driven and passionate about. I loved the opening 3 Ps, talking about passion and purpose and progress, which I think in some ways does embody this idea of impact. And I love that, that actually Daniel is evolving the museum to thinking about how computing really interfaces with humanity and meaning. And I think that's actually, that evolution that you're seeing is really a function of the state of entrepreneurship today.
So I've heard you say that now is the unique time to be an impact investor. So what do you mean by that, and why?
Well, it does come down to this idea that there's this evolution of entrepreneurs. I mean, at its core, it's a function of the entrepreneurs that walk into our office each and every day. If I think about a few short months after Pitch inspired me, and I was fortunate enough to get a job in venture capital, and think about the entrepreneurs and our deal log 24 years ago, and I contrast it with today. Each and every day, the kind of mission-driven, purpose-driven, inherent approach to what we are seeing is radically different. And so in that respect, that's absolutely what we mean by special time for impact investing. And then, of course, the investors follow the entrepreneurs, not vice versa. And so what we've seen, you I think, quoted it well in your opening, we've seen this incredible evolution of capital that is now focused on impact investing. It's actually, ironically, less so in the venture side, but we've seen the larger funds. We've seen Bain and BlackRock and TPG. Larry Fink of BlackRock, the seminal letter, one of the largest asset managers in the world, as part of their annual letter, talked about the importance of building companies with an impact mindset, and as an investor, the importance of evaluating the ESG and the impact orientation in thinking through company success. And that's, again, a transformation from how investors historically, A, allocated capital, and B, evaluated companies that they were investing in.
When we last talked, I was really amazed that it turns out that 60% of your companies are women-driven, and so I really want to stop on that and talk a little bit, because we have like 40% of our
Amazing.
Women-driven, and we thought that we're on top, but now you
Well, the venture asset class, has so much to be proud of. You referenced, like Pitch and many others, we've spent our time trying to help the venture industry on the National Venture Capital Association and other industry boards. And, the statistics around venture capital are awe-inspiring. We're about 0.1% of the capital markets, and venture-backed companies account for about 20% of GDP today. And so the leverage on entrepreneurship and venture capital is something I think we have so much to be proud of. What we don't have a lot to be proud of are the diversity numbers. And it's something I think the venture community has had a lot of talk around these issues in more recent times, but we still haven't seen much progress. We still today, the latest numbers that came out were 2018 numbers, and only 2.2% of venture-backed companies were in women-led companies. We have a radically different mindset around this, and not because of a quota, and not because of anything where we actually preordained an outcome, but because of a lens that we have around just ultimately finding the very best entrepreneurs that we can work with, the current portfolio is sitting at 64% are in women-led companies.
Whoa.
Thank you. And what I always say about our entrepreneurs, and 64% of whom happen to be women, they are not women entrepreneurs, they are great entrepreneurs. And the lens that we back are not about finding women, they're about finding great entrepreneurs. But by having a different kind of lens than we've seen traditionally in the venture asset class, and I think this is also true, by the way, around international entrepreneurs, venture capital ought to be about finding those opportunities that are less mined. Ashik did a great job, I think, at describing the percentage of dollars, of innovation dollars that go into companies based on a sector. The fact that such a big percentage of revenue goes into technology, and in fact, life science sector, does reflect that pace of innovation. But actually, it's those other sectors that represent the white space, where we haven't seen innovation historically. And it's those other entrepreneurs that we don't have, if we look in the rearview mirror, the same opportunities that we've seen historically that for us end up being the exciting opportunity to invest in.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the sectors, because you invest in a number of sectors. And one of them is energy, right? And your company is an investor in the two most successful energy company, Tesla and SolarCity. So let's talk a little bit about the energy innovation.
Yeah, so the broad theme I touched on is actually finding sectors that have historically had the desert of innovation. If you actually look at the pie chart of where we've seen venture dollars go historically, it is paradoxically in a small number of sectors, of course, with elements of tech being leading the charge. But it's left out wide sectors that have huge markets and that historically not only don't have venture dollars, but have the exact opposite statistic of what Ashik described, which is the percentage of revenue in those sectors that went back into R&D as a proxy for how these sectors think about innovation is completely upside down. So the white space opportunity is there's typically oligopolies in many of these sectors and sectors that have been dominated by companies for 100 years, as opposed to constantly seeing Moore's Law at work disrupting with new kinds of companies as we're used to in Silicon Valley. And energy, of course, is front and center of that example. We have among the largest markets in the world. We're talking about multi-trillion-dollar markets. And yet, innovation historically hasn't been ascribed to this market, whether it be the oligopolies of the utility industry or the oil and gas industries. And so if you think about that as a backdrop, what we've seen over the last about 10 years is more innovation than we've seen over the last 100 years. We've seen the cost curves. If we mapped out cost curves and we actually omitted what industry we were talking about, you could think cell phones, where the earliest cell phone was large and cost thousands of dollars, and now, of course, today, a radically different state of play. You can think flat-screen TVs. When it first came out, huge cost points, now radically lower as a result of scale. But in the energy sector, I'll bring up a few examples. Solar. In about the last 30 years, there's been 150 order of magnitude decline. We've gone from about $76 a watt to about 30 cents a watt. That cost curve is staggering when you map it against any form of technology, industry, or innovation. The LEDs, around the turn of around 2000, we were sitting here at about $100 a lumen. Now we're at about a penny a lumen. I mean, just completely different cost curves. The same has been true in wind. Storage right now, Tesla's building the largest battery manufacturing plant on the planet to get to scale, and you've seen the cost curves at the cost per kilowatt hour radically transform. So on the innovation, from an innovation standpoint, energy is just in its infancy of seeing these kinds of cost curves and opening up new opportunities. You overlay that against the backdrop of, again, big markets. Policy has been a strong pull for the sector. Now, we don't think of that today as much because of the U.S. federal policy has been stagnant. But the states have literally had as much favorable policy for this sector as we have ever seen in history. It is not just here in California, where we've had extraordinary leadership, but it is literally states like Texas that you wouldn't necessarily assume was going to actually overhaul a renewable energy industry, where today we have double-digit percentage of how Texans get their energy coming from wind. We have states like Iowa that don't necessarily come to mind when you talk about the next generation of energy, leading the charge. And then, of course, internationally, you have India that's trying to go fully electric by 2030. You have, and then, of course, the biggest behemoth of all, China, where the amount of capital being spent on innovation is literally leapfrogging the rest of the world. And so we're seeing just massive opportunity from many different places around the globe. And then I come back to the mantra that we have, which is this is all about the entrepreneurs being the best barometer of where we're going. This is not about a thesis. It's not about an analytical rear-view mirror overlay of an industry. It's about where we see unprecedented entrepreneurship. And again, contrasting it from the early days we were doing this, when it was largely technologists, it was a lot of scientists focused on the space, and it definitely, we didn't have the word serial entrepreneur when we talked about energy. Today, we have just an amazing set of entrepreneurs tackling the space. Of course, you know, I think of Elon as being a great example, going from PayPal to focusing on energy, but every day we have countless examples of entrepreneurs like this that view energy to be the next great opportunity where they want to actually spend their time.
Well, there's been a lot of innovation recently in food and ag tech, right?
Yeah.
And so you are also leading this trend. So, but as far as I know, your investments in food and ag tech are not as famous as Tesla or Solar or SpaceX. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so food and agriculture, again, fits our themes, right? Among, again, the largest markets in the world, about 30% of all global land and water are related to the food and ag industry. So from a sustainability standpoint, it fits a lot of our themes. But actually about 40% of all employment in some way relates to the food and ag industries around the world. Then you think about the problems that the food and ag industry have had historically. It is definitely one that hasn't gotten venture dollars. It is also one that hasn't historically gotten a lot of corporate R&D ascribed to it. And you also have this idea of oligopolies as opposed to new entrants that have led the charge. So you have, you know, companies like John Deere that have been around since the 1800s, and then the Monsantos of the world really have created oligopolies without much disruption and incumbency, but for the recent years we've seen. And so it fits our overarching framework. You then go to this issue of how technology can be applied to an industry that we haven't seen before. We have a company called Farmers Business Network. Many of you have probably heard of it. It's a company we did with Kleiner Perkins and Google, and we've just gotten a big late-stage round there. And it's all about empowering the small farmer. You know, you think about it, the small farmer represents about 98.5% of all farms around the world. And yet, most of these farms are run like a great-grandparent ran those farms. It's not what we think of as a Silicon Valley-run company where there are tools and technology and enterprise solutions around the analytics and decision-making. That's not how most small farms are run. And again, that represents the opportunity. So what Farmers Business Network has done is they've created tools and data analytics to enable the small farmer to run their enterprise with ways that they've never had before. And what we've been able to do is really help deal with these oligopolies on both the supply and demand side. And so what we found is farms that were literally next door to each other had complete opaqueness around their highest expenses. Their feed, some were paying as much as a 30% variance on the most expensive line item to run their business. Why? Because there wasn't an Amazon-like way of doing price comparison. That didn't exist in the small farming community. And now when we invested, it was an idea. We have more than 30 million acres under management right now that have created the ability for these farmers to actually compare how their farms are being run relative to best practices and enable them to actually get buying power as a result. So increasing productivity is a huge focus for us. FBN's a good example of that. At the other end of the spectrum, food waste is a problem that we as a society are going to have to deal with as we migrate from 7 to 10 billion people. We're going to have to figure out how are we going to feed this planet. And what we have now is the disastrous state of play where 40% of all produce that gets produced is wasted. 40% from farm to fork has zero utility. Now you think about that, first from a sustainability standpoint, all the energy and water and land that were used for 40% of production has zero utility. So we've looked over the years at a number of different solutions for this, and historically the solutions were often worse than the problem. The kinds of things that were used to enable avoidance of food spoilage had really nasty things, and not the kinds of things that we in this room would ever want to eat. That changed when we met an entrepreneur who figured out a way to extend the life of produce using only the fruits and vegetables themselves. And the upshot is they have found a way to extend the life by anywhere between 200 to 500%. Now you think about that finally being able to change the supply-demand curves of a spoiling commodity, and it has profound, not only social impact, but profound financial impact. The ability to arbitrage where the point of production is from where you can sell as a result of that spoiling asset having a much longer curve is radically transformative. And those are just a couple of the examples of the way in which we see the food and ag industries right now being disrupted in ways we haven't seen before.
Well, of course, we cannot miss the space, right? So let's talk about space. That's one of the topics, right, now.
Yeah, so this is a special day in space. Maybe we can talk about that as well. So when we were growing up, space was all about where you were going to. Getting to the moon, going to other places. It was always about where we were going. And tools and technologies have evolved to enable us to actually not just do that, but also measure and monitor planet Earth in ways we haven't had before. Now, part of that are companies like SpaceX that have figured out a way to get to space at half the cost per pound relative to NASA. But then we have companies like Planet, used to be called Planet Labs. And what they figured out how to do is how to transform the paradigm of satellites that used to be the size of a school bus, used to cost several hundreds of millions of dollars, and ultimately through the power of Moore's Law and other types of innovation now applied to space, figured out how to create a satellite that's more like a lunchbox size and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what they have done with that technology is they've created a constellation. That constellation now is such that they have created, for the first time in human history, a daily picture of everywhere on planet Earth. And the profound implication of that to so many industries, of course, there's so many mission-driven aspects to that, the ability to actually track things like deforestation or where we see natural disasters, and doing the temporal management that the company does, we love for our second bottom line. But on the first bottom line financial side, imagine if you're sitting as a trader in Chicago or New York, trading a commodity where you always have stale and dated information. And now you can actually track the most important areas of planet Earth that impact the commodity you're trading and actually get a window before others can do so. Imagine if you're a government and for intelligence reasons, you can imagine the utility of that. So profound implications with that kind of technology. And on the sustainability side, when we think about tracking the carbon and trying to tackle problems related to carbon issues, the first thing we have to do is find the carbon. And again, Planet is a great example of that.
So let's quickly switch from industries to particular companies.
Yeah.
You are one of the early investors in Tesla, and you're on board of Tesla and SpaceX. So, early investor in SpaceX, right?
Yep.
So, Tesla now market cap is what, 50 billion?
It fluctuates between 40 and 50 billion, yeah.
So tell us about your journey with this company.
It's easy to sort of talk about Tesla as, so I'll give you some recent stats. September last year was an important demarcation point. That was the month where the threshold crossed, and the #1 selling car was an electric car. It was the Model 3. Not the #1 selling electric car, not the #1 selling car in a certain car, the #1 selling car. And you think about how as many examples here in Silicon Valley, that this was literally something where just a few years ago, there were 0 cars on the road. And in a relative blink of an eye, the company has come very far. That said, we think we're really in the earliest chapter of the electrification opportunity. And in fact, what we're almost as much proud of as much as anything else is not just what Tesla's doing, but how it has radically transformed the perception and the actual product roadmap in the auto industry. I'll give you the anecdote. When we invested in this company, our friends called it contrarian. Most people had other adjectives for the investment. And the cynics and the naysayers dominated, well, they still do in some ways, but literally dominated every reaction we had to having made this investment. And in the earliest days, the constant refrain was, well, how could you have made that investment? There hasn't been a US auto OEM IPO in over 50 years. Now, I love when, fast forward, a few years later, I was fortunate enough to join Elon to ring the bell when the company went public. I remember I woke up early that day. I opened my New York hotel room. I grabbed the New York Times at the foot of my door. I went to the business section. I opened it up. And of course, the headline was, first US auto OEM IPO in over 50 years. And that's kind of the story of Silicon Valley, the notion that there's not a rearview mirror to actually track what you can do going forward is the story not just of Tesla, but the ventures that you all have and that represent the success of our industry historically. It's hard to remember the degree of cynics and naysayers. People didn't think we could take on Detroit or Germany, and now we fast forward, and there is not a single company that hasn't put massive dollars into tech centers very close to where we are sitting today. The largest companies in the auto industry have created roadmaps where electrification is at the core. I mentioned it before, but in Tesla's case, we've transformed not just the auto industry, but on the energy industry side. If you took all of the battery manufacturing plants that existed on planet Earth and put them together as if they were one, when we launched our Gigafactory, the capacity from that factory alone exceeds all other capacity. And it's that kind of scale we haven't had before that drives cost curves. And it's incredibly important. The long vision, of course, is to not only be able to generate your power through solar, but then store your power through our storage, and also have the utility of driving it through the electric vehicle. And more recently, of course, the autonomy announcement, which folks may have seen a few weeks ago, which I think are going to have profound implications on humanity and safety. Of course, from a business standpoint, opens up a world of opportunity. The reason I say we're at the infancy here is because we've tended to be a single car product roadmap historically, and what you're seeing is that over time, as we've gone from Roadster to S to X to Model 3, and with a roadmap where we have Y, the pickup truck, and the semi-truck coming out, we're beginning to have a product suite that is more reflective of an automobile industry.
We're running out of time, but I cannot miss this question. So as an investor, how on earth possibly could you invest in a company, SpaceX, right? I'm talking about the SpaceX, after 2 failed launches and sort of complete disaster, right? And you put money in this company. And well, now it's obviously the leader in the launch industry. But let's talk just a little bit about that. That's very important.
Yeah, sort of harken back. So what Anna's referring to is at the time I initially invested, there were 2 failed launches, and the company was gearing up to do its 3rd launch, and it was really a binary outcome in many ways. If it succeeded, the company would move on, and if it didn't, it would probably destroy the company. And you know, I give so much credit to the SpaceX engineers. They have literally attracted the very best in industry, coupled with some of the most incredible engineers who are actually revamping the industry. And they, like many of these companies, the theme of tenacity and perseverance and getting through those tough times clearly is emblematic in both SpaceX and Tesla. You know, I always say for any one of our startups that succeeded, it's not a question of whether there's potholes, it's not a question of whether there's dead ends that you run into. It is all a question of the ability of navigating around those potholes and moving and bobbing and weaving when you hit those dead ends. And SpaceX has done an extraordinary job. If you fast forward, the third launch, of course, worked. If you fast forward now, about a decade plus ahead, it's the dominant launch provider in the world. The number 2 provider in the world is not a company, it is a country. The number 3 provider, also not a company, a country. It gets to number 4, where we have our first competitor that is actually a company. And again, this was against the backdrop of oligopolies, and when the company was started, the mantra and the refrain was, how can you take on the big, powerful oligopolies of this industry? And again, that represents the opportunity for us if we actually find innovations that leapfrog. I referenced today's a very special day, assuming weather permitting. But if we fast forward, now we have an amazing track record around launch. It became the number 1 provider, not for one very important reason, and that's reliability. And then for those who don't know SpaceX, it completely re-architected and it created an amazing engineering feat to create reusability for the rocket. How many people flew here today? Okay, when you got off the plane, did they throw away the plane? Okay, that was the state of play in the rocket industry before SpaceX came along. And when you think about what SpaceX has done, which is the ability to amortize the cost of 70% of that rocket on future launch, they've been able to decrease the cost profoundly as a result. Now fast forward, having done that, tonight, hopefully, will mark the first 60 satellites that the company is launching to create a communications network. And what they've done is, using their vertical integration of launch, they have also created a new paradigm around the type and size and cost of satellites for the communications industry, akin to what I described what Planet's doing for the imagery side of the equation. And the idea is to create a constellation around planet Earth. In fact, in their case, it's called a blanket. And that blanket aspires to create internet access and equal internet access everywhere on planet Earth. It doesn't matter if you're in Silicon Valley, New York, LA, Chicago, DC, another major city center around the globe, or if you are in an urban village, if you're in a remote village in a developing country. The idea is to create the same opportunity for internet access. On the energy side, we have a company that's tackling the 1.5 billion that lack access that we take for granted with a grid that creates lights atop our head right now. And trying to provide energy access is one of our other companies. But the analog here is today, and I don't know how many people realize this, there are 3 billion people across our planet that today lack access to broadband internet that we take for granted when we wake up every day. And so again, the ability to provide that and do so economically is something that is going to represent the next chapter of the SpaceX story.
Ira, well, thank you so much. We're so very proud of having you here.
Thanks.
And best of luck with your investments.
Great to be here. Thank you.